Hey guys, tonight we have an unusual story to share. One that might just surprise you with how much intrigue can be hidden in something as simple as a bottle of wine. Picture yourself walking through a vineyard in Italy. The sun sets in the distance, casting golden hues over the rolling hills, and you inhale deeply the sweet, earthy scent of grapes ripening on the vine. It's peaceful idyllic, right? Now, imagine that nestled somewhere between the barrels of wine in the cellar, a subtle criminal operation is quietly thriving. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't forget to let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is. I'm curious to hear. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's hard to believe that something as benign as wine could be involved in a massive international smuggling operation. After all, Italy's wine industry is as old as the country itself, and the sight of wine casks being shipped out of vineyards is far from unusual. But within these barrels, a far more secretive and lucrative business was taking place. Smuggling rings are often associated with illicit drugs or stolen goods. But in this case, the criminal masterminds weren't looking for high-profile contraband. No, they'd found a quieter, more unsuspecting way to get their illegal goods across borders. And it wasn't just about avoiding customs checks. It was about operating under the radar, inside a thriving industry that to the untrained eye seemed completely legitimate. This subtle operation was buried within the very casks that held Italy's finest wines. But how does one go from a fine wine cask to hidden contraband? And more importantly, why did this operation continue for so long without getting caught? It wasn't the kind of crime that would make headlines. No violent acts, no high-speed chases, just a slow, methodical operation built on the trust of the global trade system. Let's step inside this hidden world, where wine wasn't just the product, it was the cover. The wine cask, in all its humble glory, became the perfect vessel for a smuggling operation. To the untrained eye, it was nothing more than a sturdy barrel, expertly crafted to store and preserve the liquid gold of the Italian countryside. But within these barrels, something much more illicit was concealed. Goods that could be moved across borders with ease, unnoticed by customs agents, inspectors, and the average person. The wine industry itself was thriving, a proud part of Italy's economy and cultural identity. It was a billion-dollar enterprise, exporting wines across the globe, from tiny boutique shops in New York to the grand restaurants of Paris. Customs inspections were routine, but they were mostly perfunctory, often conducted with the assumption that everything in the wine trade was above board. After all, it was wine, a product of tradition, history, and pride. What could possibly be hidden inside something so noble? But there was a small group of smugglers who realized the potential of this very assumption. Wine was a product that was largely untouchable by law enforcement. The wine casks were bulky and sturdy, difficult to inspect without fully breaking them open. The materials that made up the casks themselves were heavy and resistant to damage, providing the perfect disguise for illicit cargo. So, what did the masterminds behind the operation do? They began using the very thing that made wine so valuable, its exportation, as a means to move illegal goods across borders. And the goods they hid weren't exactly low stakes either. Smuggled inside the barrels of high-end wine were a variety of illegal items, artifacts, rare antiques, and even illicit pharmaceuticals. These goods, which could have been easily detected in a more traditional shipping method, were carefully concealed beneath the layers of wine-soaked wood, disguised as part of the legitimate export. They took advantage of every small imperfection in the system, exploiting loopholes in regulations that allowed wine exports to move across borders with little scrutiny. What made the operation even more difficult to detect was the cleverness of its execution. The goods were not packed all in one cask, but rather spread across several shipments. So, if one shipment was intercepted or flagged for inspection, the smugglers had a dozen others moving right behind it, each carrying just a fraction of the illicit cargo. It was the perfect smuggling network, slow, methodical, and yet nearly impossible to catch. To make things even more challenging for authorities, the wine was legitimate. It was made with the same care, the same attention to detail as any other high-quality Italian vintage. Each cask was inspected, certified, and sold through the appropriate channels. The smugglers didn't just manufacture fake wine, they used real wine to cover their tracks. This made it nearly impossible for customs agents to distinguish between what was legal and what was illegal. It was a brilliant tactic, turning a product celebrated for its purity into the perfect vehicle for contraband. Even those working in the wine industry were oblivious to the operation. The vineyards that grew the grapes, the winemakers who crushed the fruit, and the distributors who shipped the barrels. None of them had any idea that they were unknowingly part of an illicit network. To them, the wine was simply a product they were proud of, something that had been part of their heritage for generations. The smugglers knew that in such an environment, no one would suspect the barrels. It was all part of the charm of the wine industry. Everyone trusted it, and no one thought to look too closely. It's interesting to think about how something so simple, an everyday commodity like wine, could be used as the perfect cover for such a large-scale operation. The smugglers understood the trust placed in the product, and they used that to their advantage. They didn't need to resort to flashy methods, to high-profile smuggling tactics. No, they simply worked within the system, moving quietly in the shadows, knowing that the more they looked like legitimate businessmen, the less likely they were to attract suspicion. As the operation grew, so did the sophistication of the methods. The smugglers began working with a network of insiders, people in various industries who could help them circumvent customs checks. There were the truck drivers who knew how to pass through toll booths without being flagged, the importers who could get the paperwork stamped without ever asking too many questions. The smugglers were savvy, relying not just on the wine casks, but on a network of contacts who helped ensure their goods were always moving, always one step ahead of any law enforcement efforts. Yet, for all its sophistication, the operation remained hidden because it relied on the most mundane of things, a wine cask. An item so familiar, so rooted in Italian culture, that it was often overlooked. And while some might have suspected the presence of illicit goods in the industry, no one imagined that wine itself could be part of the smuggling game. The real question, of course, is how long the operation could last. Smuggling, by nature, is a risky business. Sooner or later, someone makes a mistake, a tip-off is made, or something slips through the cracks. The question wasn't whether the operation would end, it was when. By now, the wine cask smuggling operation had become so ingrained in the global trade system that the authorities were practically blind to it. It wasn't just about Italy anymore. Smuggled goods were flowing through ports from Europe to Asia, North America to the Middle East. Every major wine exporting country had been unknowingly roped into the operation, all while the masterminds behind the scheme stayed in the shadows, operating with a quiet confidence. The mastermind of this intricate network, who we'll call the sommelier, knew that he couldn't stay in the shadows forever. Like any good criminal operation, the longer it ran, the higher the stakes became. As the profits grew, so did the complexity of the operation. The goods being smuggled inside the casks became more varied and valuable. The wine itself, still high quality, but now part of something darker, became the perfect cover for increasingly high-stakes contraband. Antiques stolen from museums, rare animal products, and even high-end electronics. These weren't just items from an illegal market. They were things that would fetch millions if sold through the right channels. The sommelier's organization was meticulous in its operation. It wasn't a single mastermind running it all. It was a group of people, each with their own piece of the puzzle. There were vineyard owners, smugglers, truck drivers, and middlemen working at various stages of the process, all of whom believed they were simply doing their part in the legitimate wine trade. This allowed the operation to operate with the fluidity and scale that made it so successful. No one person had all the information, which meant no one could ever blow the whistle on the whole network. The vineyard owners were some of the key players in the operation. At first glance, they were just hard-working people making wine, cultivating vineyards that had been in their families for generations. They grew their crops, harvested their grapes, and created their wine. But somewhere along the line, they became part of something bigger. The sommelier paid them handsomely to use their labels on wine casks that weren't just filled with vintage Chianti or Barolo. They were filled with contraband. The vineyard owners didn't even know what was in the casks, and they didn't need to. All they had to do was let the shipments go, with a handshake and a signed invoice. Then came the middlemen, the individuals who took the casks from the vineyards and transported them to various shipping ports. This is where the smuggling operation really flourished. The casks were loaded onto trucks, which drove through some of the most heavily trafficked highways in Europe. Yet, despite the volume of these shipments, the casks passed through customs without a hitch. Thanks to their carefully constructed relationships with local customs agents, the sommelier's network ensured that the shipments didn't just pass inspection. They breezed through with barely a second glance. The middlemen had their own network of suppliers who helped move the goods without suspicion. These intermediaries played an integral role in ensuring the smuggled goods stayed hidden. They were the ones who dealt directly with port officials, trucking companies, and even freight handlers. They would bring in fresh wine, make it seem as though it was just another shipment of ordinary vintage, and quietly slip the hidden contraband into various countries. The wine casks became the perfect Trojan horse. What could be more innocent than a barrel of fine wine being shipped across international borders? What made the whole operation so successful was how deeply it had integrated into the legitimate global wine trade. The sommelier had worked for years to ensure that everyone involved felt like they were part of a well-oiled machine. In the world of wine exports, timing was everything. If a shipment was delayed for even a few days, it could trigger suspicion. But with the right people in the right positions, every shipment moved according to plan. Ports received their cargo in record time, customs cleared them without so much as a raised eyebrow, and the smugglers made their deliveries without ever being noticed. The mastermind, with his quiet authority and charm, had created a system so efficient, so inconspicuous, that it was nearly impossible to detect. He didn't rely on brute force or flashy escapes. He relied on subtlety. There were no gunfights or high-speed chases. Instead, his success was built on precision and patience. The operation moved like clockwork. Everything in place, everyone in the right position, and nothing ever out of place. But as with all great operations, there were cracks in the system. The smugglers began to feel the weight of their own success. It wasn't about the wine anymore. It was about the value of the goods being transported. What started as a small operation became an empire, with shipments worth millions being moved through ports every day. The value of what was being smuggled grew so high that people began to take notice. Law enforcement agencies in various countries started to catch on. The masterminds, ever vigilant, knew that the more valuable their shipments became, the more likely they were to attract attention. Still, the sommelier remained calm. He had spent years building this operation, and he knew exactly how to keep it running. But no matter how flawless the system seemed, he was aware that things could go wrong at any moment. As the operation expanded, the stakes got higher, and the risk of being caught increased. There would come a time when even the best-laid plans couldn't account for everything. It wasn't a matter of if the operation would be discovered. It was a matter of when. The question was, could the sommelier keep his secret hidden long enough to make his escape? The sommelier, though aware of the growing risks, couldn't help but marvel at the brilliance of his operation. After years of careful planning and seamless execution, he had created something extraordinary. An empire built on the trust people had in wine, a commodity so universally beloved that it provided the perfect cover for an underground network of smuggling. But with success came increased attention. Law enforcement agencies, particularly in Europe and North America, began to notice an alarming trend. Unusual volumes of fine wine being shipped through ports with little explanation or documentation. These weren't your typical wine shipments. They were significantly more frequent, and the paperwork was always in perfect order. Still, something felt off. Even the most trained customs agents started to question the flow of goods. The operation's ability to stay under the radar relied on an intricate system of trust and silence. The sommelier and his team knew how to keep their dealings isolated from the wider world. Those who were part of the operation believed they were only handling ordinary wine shipments, never questioning where the shipments ultimately went or what might be hidden beneath the labels. But this system wasn't foolproof. One morning, a particularly sharp customs officer at a major port in Italy noticed a shipment that seemed unusual. The casks were labeled with a high-end vintage, and the papers were flawless as usual. But something about the weight didn't match the records. The casks, although they were labeled as filled with a well-known red wine, seemed far heavier than they should have been. Intrigued, the officer requested a secondary inspection, something that was rare in the busy port. When the cask was cracked open, the officer was shocked to find not just wine, but also high-end electronics, tablets, smartphones, and other luxury tech items. It wasn't the first time contraband had been hidden in shipments, but the scale and value of this discovery were unprecedented. The customs officer's suspicion was well-founded. This wasn't just a minor smuggling operation. This was something much larger. But what was even more alarming was the meticulous nature of the shipment. The electronics had been packed so expertly into the cask that the contents seemed entirely natural, even to a seasoned inspector. The discovery was a small crack in an otherwise impenetrable wall. The authorities now had proof that something unusual was happening, but they had no idea what they were up against. The sommelier, ever the perfectionist, had planned for such a possibility. He had accounted for every contingency, down to the smallest detail. But he had underestimated one thing: human curiosity. The authorities, now alerted, began a quiet investigation. They had to move carefully. The last thing they wanted was to alert the smugglers that they were onto them. They tapped into local vineyards, discreetly asking questions about the unusual shipments, but everyone in the industry simply shrugged it off. Wine shipments came and went all the time. Who would suspect that beneath the delicate fragrance of aged Bordeaux, something far more valuable was being hidden? The smuggling operation had remained so subtle for so long because it used the everyday nature of wine trade to its advantage. No one expected anything unusual. The authorities, always overworked and understaffed, were slow to pick up on the oddities that dotted the industry. And when they did begin to notice, it was as if the network was several steps ahead of them. The sommelier had surrounded himself with an army of skilled handlers, men and women who knew the wine trade inside and out and were able to move his goods swiftly, efficiently, and without raising suspicion. Each member of his team had a part to play, and each of them knew their role in the larger picture. Yet the cracks in the system were beginning to widen. The authorities were getting closer. The tip-off from the alert customs officer, combined with the whispers from the local communities, led them to re-examine older shipments. Soon, they began piecing together a picture of what was really happening. As the investigation gathered steam, the sommelier knew the time had come to make his move. He could feel the pressure building, like the slow tightening of a noose around his neck. The authorities weren't yet fully aware of the extent of his operation, but they were getting closer, and he needed to act fast. The delicate balance of his smuggling ring was on the verge of collapsing, and the whispers of law enforcement were getting louder. The sommelier had one ace left to play. In the sprawling vineyard estates, hidden from prying eyes, the last remnants of his operation sat ready to be moved. His network had carefully stashed smuggled goods across Europe, each one waiting to be shipped, and he had contacts who could make these shipments vanish without a trace. He needed only a small window of opportunity, a few days, maybe weeks, before the authorities connected the dots. But those days were numbered. Knowing that the authorities would soon be watching more closely, the sommelier began to move his goods more discreetly, using smaller, private shipments that slipped past customs. He worked quickly, trying to salvage what he could before the inevitable confrontation. His plan was simple: scatter his network, erase all traces of his operation, and disappear before anyone could track him down. But his luck was running out. A new informant, one from within his inner circle, had given the authorities the last crucial piece of the puzzle. The authorities now knew the route of his shipments, the names of key players, and the locations of the hidden caches of goods. The noose was tightening, and even the sommelier's considerable charm and resourcefulness couldn't prevent what was coming. The sommelier's carefully crafted operation was now on the brink of collapse. He had always been able to stay ahead of the game, but this time he felt the walls closing in. The authorities, armed with the new information from the informant, were now just a few steps behind him. His network was unraveling piece by piece, and every move he made seemed to be leading them closer to his hiding places. Desperation crept into his thoughts. The same confidence that had once guided him through the smuggling trade now seemed like a distant memory. For the first time in years, the sommelier felt uncertain, not of his plan, but of the speed at which it was falling apart. The hidden compartments in the casks, the networks of insiders who had helped him, everything was under threat. The tipping point had arrived. But even with everything falling apart, the sommelier wasn't one to give up without a fight. He knew that he couldn't risk moving the bulk of his operations through the same routes. The authorities were too aware of the usual pathways. So, he started to plan his escape. The smuggling network he had once ruled with an iron grip was now in chaos. But he was a master of the long game, and he wasn't going to let it all slip away without making one final daring move. The decision to scatter his operation wasn't one made lightly. It wasn't just about disappearing. It was about ensuring that, even if he was caught, he could rebuild. After all, the wine casks had served him well in the past, and their function wasn't over yet. As the authorities closed in on some of his network's key players, the sommelier began moving small amounts of contraband using more obscure, less traceable methods. something no one would expect. His plan was simple, yet brilliant. He would use the very thing that had helped him succeed all these years, wine, to throw off the authorities for good. By branching out to smaller, more isolated vineyards in remote regions of Italy, he was able to start new shipments under the guise of creating artisanal, small-batch wines. In doing so, he could once again use the casks, which had become his perfect cover, to conceal valuable goods. But now, the authorities were getting smarter. They had caught on to the change in the smuggling patterns. The customs officials, now working with international law enforcement, had begun to notice the shifts in trade routes. Small shipments, previously thought to be harmless, were suddenly coming under closer scrutiny. The authorities had learned from their mistakes. They began to see the patterns, shifting from larger operations to smaller, seemingly legitimate shipments, and they knew something was up. Still, the sommelier was skilled at deception. His operation, once so large, now operated in the shadows, smaller in scope but harder to track. While the authorities were focusing on the big players, he had quietly slipped away, utilizing new methods that made him even harder to pin down. The mastermind's network, though fragmented, was still operational. Smuggling continued, albeit on a smaller scale. The remaining members of the operation continued to move the goods, shifting with the winds of international trade. They used any number of clever tactics to avoid detection: false labeling, forged documents, and hidden compartments in new shipping containers. But the operation was under closer scrutiny than ever before. Despite the authorities' increased vigilance, they struggled to connect the final dots. The sommelier's final layer of protection, the trusted insiders, had begun to desert him, leaving only a few loyal ones who had been involved for so long they couldn't afford to step away. The sommelier, now an isolated figure, knew that his chances were dwindling. But he wasn't giving up. A last-ditch plan was already in motion. The sommelier knew the financial world well. If there was one thing he understood, it was how to find new avenues to operate in, how to find weaknesses in the system and exploit them. His plan wasn't to escape quietly. It was to disappear into the global financial network and re-emerge as someone else. He would cut ties with the old operation, bury the illicit trade of rare antiques and electronics, and let his new venture be the mask that hid his true identity. He knew it wouldn't be easy. His name had been tied to the smuggling operation for so long, and the authorities wouldn't just let him slip away without a fight. But as the smuggling network continued to splinter, and his operatives were either arrested or scared off, the sommelier began to see his chance. His next move would be his final one, before the full force of the law finally caught up with him. For all of his careful planning, one question still lingered. Could he truly escape everything he had built? Or had the price of his empire's fall become too high? With the authorities closing in and his network slowly unraveling, the sommelier knew his time was running out. The question wasn't whether the authorities would catch him. It was how long he could delay the inevitable. But in the back of his mind, the thought persisted. There was always a way out. There had to be. And if he could just move quickly enough, if he could cover his tracks just a little longer, there might be one final escape. Even if it meant using the same methods that had brought him to the top: deception, disguise, and control. The sommelier, sitting alone in his small, sparse office, what had once been a luxurious office in a wine estate, but now was nothing more than a temporary hideout, poured himself a glass of wine. It was a rare vintage, one of his favorites, from a small vineyard he had once used to smuggle. As the amber liquid swirled in the glass, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. The game was almost over. He had been in this world for too long, built up too much to let it all crumble in a few months. But the cracks in his carefully constructed empire were too deep now. The authorities were closing in, and the weight of their pursuit was unbearable. He had known it would come to this eventually, but not so soon. Not when he still had so much left to move. His entire career had been built on the art of patience and timing, but now it seemed like the clock was ticking faster than ever before. He set down his glass and started to think through his options. There were still paths open to him, small, risky paths, but the stakes had never been higher. The operation, though weakened, wasn't entirely destroyed yet. There were still some key contacts willing to move goods for him, but those connections were dwindling. The network that had once spread across continents was now reduced to a few loyal operatives, and most of them were nervous about their involvement. He had done everything he could to hide, to lay low, but the authorities had finally begun to piece everything together. They had followed the smuggling trail from the moment they discovered the electronics hidden in the casks, and now they had started tracking the money. His digital footprint, which had once been a useful tool to arrange the shipments, was now a trail leading directly to him. He had to move fast, and he had to make sure that no one was left who could talk. The sommelier was no stranger to risk. It was a part of the game, the thrill that had kept him going for all these years. But even he had to admit that the odds were stacked against him. The authorities weren't just trying to take down a small-time smuggler. They were trying to dismantle an entire network that had been operating for decades. For the first time in his career, he felt cornered. Despite the mounting pressure, he found himself reflecting on the operation's early days. It had all seemed so simple then. Wine casks, tucked away in secret locations, moving under the guise of legitimate shipments. But now, what had seemed like a foolproof plan had turned into a web of lies too complicated to keep hidden. The authorities had done their homework. They knew where to look, and they knew who to talk to. He'd once been a master of manipulation, but now he was just another man on the run, clinging to a crumbling empire. The one thing that had worked in his favor was his ability to keep his operation decentralized. He had never relied on a single location, a single person. His wine casks moved across borders, through ports and over mountains, always in motion, always hard to pin down. But now, that same network that had once made him untouchable was closing in on him. The sommelier knew he needed to get out, and fast. He picked up his phone and dialed one of his last remaining contacts. A driver who worked in the black market trade, a man who had moved goods for him in the past. The man was reliable, but he had always been on the edge of the law, and the sommelier knew he'd have to offer him something big to get him to act quickly. The phone rang for what seemed like forever. Finally, the line clicked, and a voice on the other end answered. "What do you need?" The sommelier exhaled slowly. "I need to move quickly. I need to leave. You still have those connections in Switzerland." There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by a hesitant reply. "I do, but it won't be easy. They'll be looking for you, you know." "I know," the sommelier replied, his voice low but steady. "But I've got to move now. It's the only chance I've got." The conversation turned to logistics. The driver would help him get out of Italy and into Switzerland, where the sommelier could disappear. But even as he made the plans, a gnawing feeling in the pit of his stomach told him it might be too late. The authorities were close, and their investigation was reaching its peak. He couldn't afford to waste any more time. As he prepared to leave, he thought about the many shipments he had moved in the past. The wine casks filled with forbidden goods, the high-stakes deals, the secrecy, the constant game of cat and mouse. It was a life he had chosen, and it had brought him wealth, power, and influence. But it had also come with a price. Now, that price was catching up with him. The sommelier grabbed his jacket, his last remaining assets, and quietly exited the building, careful not to attract attention. He knew that the next few hours would determine his fate. If he could make it out of the country, if he could make it to Switzerland and disappear into the shadows, he might just be able to rebuild. But if he didn't move fast enough, the authorities would be on him in no time. As he stepped into the night, the cold air hit his face, a sharp reminder of the stakes. He was no longer the mastermind of an empire. He was just another fugitive, trying to escape the consequences of his own creation. The clock was ticking. The moon hung high in the sky as the sommelier made his way through the winding streets of the small Italian town, his footsteps echoing quietly in the night. He'd made it this far, but he knew the most dangerous part of the plan was still ahead. Even though he had contacts and resources, the authorities were closing in quickly. His entire life had been one carefully calculated move after another, but now, for the first time, he was simply reacting to forces beyond his control. As he reached the back entrance of the warehouse where the driver had arranged for him to meet, the sense of urgency grew. Every corner he turned, every street he crossed, felt like a potential trap. His mind raced as he thought about the operation he had run for so long. The smuggling ring, the network of people who had helped him move illicit goods, all the pieces that had once worked so seamlessly together. Now, the network was nothing more than a series of broken links, each leading closer to his eventual capture. The driver had been reliable in the past, but the sommelier couldn't shake the feeling that this time was different. It was as if the air had shifted, and everything he had once taken for granted, his ability to manipulate situations, to stay one step ahead, had abandoned him. His fingers gripped the small duffel bag at his side. Inside were his most prized possessions, the ones that could help him disappear into the shadows. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. The warehouse was old, its walls weathered from years of use, but it had been a perfect hiding spot for the operation in its prime. The sommelier had moved goods through this very warehouse on countless occasions. Now it would be his last chance to escape. He pushed open the creaky door, his senses heightened. A single overhead light flickered in the dusty, empty space. "You're here," a voice called out from the shadows. The sommelier tensed but relaxed when he saw the driver step into the light, a familiar figure in a worn leather jacket. The driver, whose face was partially obscured by a cap, nodded and waved him forward. "Everything's ready. The car's waiting. It's the usual route, but you need to be fast," the driver said, his voice low and urgent. "The roads are watched. The police are everywhere." The sommelier glanced around the warehouse, feeling the walls closing in on him. "I don't have time for mistakes," he said, his voice steady but laced with tension. "We move now or not at all." The driver's eyes flickered with a mix of understanding and caution. He had no love for the sommelier, but they had done business together for years. The driver knew that helping him escape would likely mean danger for himself, but he didn't hesitate. They were already too deep into this to back out now. The two men moved swiftly through the warehouse to a side door, where an old, unmarked van was parked. The sommelier's heart raced as he climbed into the passenger seat. He couldn't afford to be caught. Not now. Not when he had come so close to disappearing. As the van pulled out of the warehouse, the driver took a sharp left and accelerated down the narrow alleyways. The familiar streets of the town blurred past him. In the distance, the first signs of dawn were creeping over the horizon, but he had no time to appreciate the beauty of the sunrise. The sommelier's thoughts were focused solely on the road ahead and the precarious journey he had ahead of him. The van was nothing special, nondescript, just like any other delivery vehicle, but its simplicity was its strength. It blended in perfectly with the rest of the traffic. The driver, having done this many times before, knew the back roads and the best ways to avoid detection. They were going to the outskirts of the city, where a small private airstrip would be their ticket out. "Once we hit the road to Switzerland, we'll be safe," the driver muttered as he turned down another side street. "But we need to stay off the main highways for now. The authorities are watching everything that moves." The sommelier nodded, his fingers tapping nervously on the leather seat. He had spent years building this empire, and now, in a matter of hours, he was about to lose it all. But even with the pressure mounting, he couldn't afford to panic. Panic was what had ruined so many operations in the past. It was about keeping calm, staying focused. "Do you have everything you need?" the driver asked, glancing at the sommelier. "Money? Papers? The backup plan?" The sommelier looked down at the duffel bag in his lap. "It's all here. I just need to get out. Once I'm in Switzerland, I can start over." The driver said nothing, but there was a shift in his demeanor, a slight unease that the sommelier couldn't ignore. The driver had seen many people come and go, but he knew that the sommelier's operation had been different. It had been larger than anything they had worked on before. It had involved more people, more resources, and more risks. And yet, it had all been undone in the blink of an eye. "I'll take you to the airstrip," the driver said after a long silence. "But I can't be seen with you after that. You know the risks." "I understand," the sommelier replied. He didn't need any more explanation. The driver was taking a considerable risk by helping him escape, and once they got to the airstrip, their paths would diverge. The sommelier would disappear into the wind, and the driver would return to his life of obscurity. The van continued down the darkened streets, taking turns with ease as they made their way out of the city. The sommelier's mind raced, constantly running through scenarios, thinking of what could go wrong. Every small bump in the road, every passing vehicle, made him tense. He had to get out. He had to escape. The thought of being caught, of facing the consequences of his years of smuggling, was unbearable. But as they neared the edge of the city, the sommelier couldn't help but feel a strange sense of finality. Everything he had worked for, every secret shipment, every hidden cask of contraband, had led to this moment. And no matter what happened next, he knew that the life he had built, the empire he had created, was finally coming to an end. The van turned off the main road and began winding through a series of narrow, unlit lanes that bordered the town's outskirts. The sommelier's breath quickened as the sound of the engine hummed steadily, but his mind was elsewhere. The weight of his decisions, of the life he'd led for so many years, pressed on him like an unspoken truth. Everything had led to this moment, and yet, in the quiet of the van, the consequences of his actions felt like they were catching up with him in ways he hadn't fully anticipated. The driver's grip on the wheel tightened, and the atmosphere in the van shifted. There was a sense of urgency now, a realization that time was slipping away. "We're getting close," the driver muttered, his eyes scanning the road ahead. "Just hold tight." The sommelier didn't answer. Instead, he watched the passing scenery, the familiar landscape that he once called home now slipping into the rearview mirror. His mind raced, not with fear, but with a strange mixture of anticipation and regret. He had done it. He had outsmarted the system for years, but now it felt like the final curtain was coming down. He was slipping through the cracks, trying to outrun everything he had built and everything he had broken. The van swerved off the lane, entering a small, secluded area, surrounded by overgrown grass and dilapidated buildings. The air felt different here, crisp, fresh, but heavy with the stillness of secrecy. The driver slowed the van, and turned into a hidden alleyway where a small airstrip came into view. It was more of a private landing site than an official airport, tucked away in the rural expanse, designed for those who needed to avoid detection. The sommelier could feel his heart rate increase as the van came to a stop near a plane waiting on the tarmac. The small aircraft was a nondescript model, low-key enough to avoid radar detection, but capable of carrying just enough to get him out of the country. It was his escape, a simple plane, a new life waiting across the border. The driver killed the engine, and the sommelier sat still for a moment, collecting his thoughts. He could see the plane's door open in the distance, its crew awaiting him. He'd been through this routine hundreds of times in his mind, but now it was real, more real than he had ever imagined. His empire, the years of smuggling, the deception, the delicate network of people. Everything was about to be left behind. "You sure you're ready?" the driver asked, his voice tinged with a mix of caution and concern. The sommelier nodded, his face set in determination. It's too late to turn back now. He stepped out of the van and into the cool night air, feeling the gravity of the situation with every step he took. The driver's voice followed him. "I don't know where you're going, and frankly, I don't want to know. But if you get caught, I won't," the sommelier interjected quickly, turning to look the driver in the eye. "You've done your part. Now get out of here. I'll take it from here." The driver hesitated, but didn't argue. He knew the risks involved. He wasn't naive. He had been working in the shadows of the world for too long to pretend that there were no consequences. The sommelier had been the mastermind of an operation that spanned continents, but now he was on the run. The driver had his own survival to think about. Without another word, the driver slid into the van and pulled away, disappearing into the shadows of the night. The sommelier watched him go, and for a brief moment felt an unexpected pang of loneliness. But there was no time for sentimentality. He had one objective: get on the plane and disappear. He approached the aircraft, the small steps beneath his feet echoing in the silence of the airstrip. The plane crew, two men in nondescript clothing, greeted him briefly, but there was no time for pleasantries. The sommelier moved quickly, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of trouble. The airstrip, though secluded, was not entirely safe. He couldn't let his guard down now. As he climbed into the plane and settled into the small, cramped seat, he felt a strange sense of finality. This was it. He would be flying out of Italy, out of the life he'd built for years. The world that had once been at his fingertips was now closing its doors on him. The plane's engines roared to life, and the small aircraft began to roll down the tarmac, picking up speed. The sommelier stared out the window, watching the runway blur beneath him as they lifted into the night sky. Italy, his home, was receding into the distance, his final link to the empire he had spent so long constructing, now nothing more than a distant memory. As the plane soared higher, the sommelier's mind wandered back to the beginning, to the vineyards, the shipments, the wine casks that had hidden so many secrets. For a moment, he remembered the taste of the wine, the rich, full-bodied flavors that had marked the height of his success. It seemed so innocent, so simple. But beneath its surface was a world of complexity, of lies, of things hidden away, waiting to be uncovered. But now he was gone. The operation was still out there in the world, but it was no longer his to control. His hands had been forced, and he had made his choice. In the quiet hum of the plane, the reality of the situation sank in. There would be no more shipments, no more wine casks, no more deception. The sommelier, once the orchestrator of an empire built on secrecy and manipulation, now had to face the truth. The cost of the life he had lived was his own freedom. The plane continued its ascent, leaving the warm, familiar landscapes of Italy behind. The sommelier's gaze remained fixed out the window as the small aircraft climbed higher into the night sky. The wind outside howled against the plane's wings, but within the cabin, everything was eerily still. His thoughts, like the plane, had lifted above the noise of the past few days, and he found himself contemplating the journey he had just begun, one that would be far more uncertain than any he had navigated before. As the lights of Italy dimmed in the distance, replaced by the dark expanse of the sea below, the sommelier allowed himself to relax for the first time in what felt like ages. The frantic pace of the last few months, the growing pressure as law enforcement had finally begun closing in, seemed distant now. But even as his body relaxed, his mind remained restless. His entire life had been shaped by the wine trade, and the illicit business he'd built around it had become so deeply ingrained in his every move, in every decision he made. The wine casks, the shipments, the hidden compartments, everything had worked like clockwork for so long. But that system, the empire, had all crumbled in a matter of weeks. And now, as the plane cut through the night sky, all he could think about was how easily it had all fallen apart. The realization was sobering. The system that had given him power, that had made him rich and influential, was built on a delicate foundation of trust and secrecy. And now, it was nothing more than a string of broken promises and missing links. There was no going back. He had tried to manipulate fate, to outwit the authorities, to play the game long enough to escape with his wealth and his freedom. But in the end, it had caught up with him. Switzerland, he whispered softly to himself. A new life, a clean slate. It sounded like a far-off dream, something impossible. But in the somber quiet of the cabin, with the hum of the engines as the only sound, the idea of starting over seemed oddly comforting. He had money stashed away, enough to make a new life for himself, far from the criminal world he had once ruled. No more casks filled with contraband, no more high-stakes games. Perhaps he could find peace, perhaps he could rebuild, but this time with something more legitimate. But there was something else that tugged at him, something he couldn't shake. Even as the thought of a new life in Switzerland filled his mind, another thought lingered, like a whisper in the back of his consciousness. It was the knowledge that he would never be truly free from his past. The authorities might be distracted for now, and he might have bought himself a little time, but the truth was someone somewhere would eventually find him. And when they did, the full weight of his criminal empire would crash down on him. The plane shook slightly as it hit some turbulence, and for a brief moment, the sommelier was jolted from his thoughts. He exhaled, trying to relax, but his mind refused to quiet. The operation he had run for years had been too intricate, too massive to simply disappear into the night. The goods he had smuggled, artifacts, electronics, rare and valuable items, would never fade into obscurity. The money might be laundered, the names changed, but somewhere, someone was always watching, always tracking, waiting to catch up with the past. And it was that thought that made him uneasy. He had spent years building an empire in the shadows, surrounded by people who trusted him, people who had helped him navigate the complexities of the criminal world. But now, as he flew further from it all, he realized how fragile his entire existence had been. The empire he had created wasn't made of stone. It was made of smoke, fleeting and ever-changing. As the plane flew on, the sommelier allowed himself to close his eyes for a moment, though sleep was far from him. His mind was too active, too filled with memories of his rise to power and the inevitable fall that had followed. The next few hours of the flight passed in a blur. The sommelier's body was on its way to Switzerland, but his mind was still tangled in the complexities of his past. He couldn't help but think of the people he had left behind, his contacts, his partners, the vineyard owners who had unknowingly worked alongside him. The lives of those who had been caught in his web, the lives he had ruined for his own gain. It wasn't just the authorities he had to outrun, it was the weight of his own conscience. He'd spent so long living with deception, thinking that the end always justified the means, that it took a while for him to realize the true cost of his actions. The people he had manipulated, the communities he had hurt, and the quiet suffering of those who had been part of his operation for so long. All of it was catching up with him now. But there was no time for regret, not now. The plane had reached cruising altitude, and the sommelier could feel the heavy silence of his situation. The clock was ticking, and the stakes were higher than ever. The authorities had given him a head start, but they wouldn't stop searching for him. He could keep running for a while, but eventually his past would catch up with him. And when it did, he would have to face the consequences of the life he had led. The plane continued its steady flight, cutting through the night, heading for Switzerland, but the sommelier knew one thing for sure. There was no escaping his past. The plane finally touched down on the quiet Swiss runway, the hum of the engines fading into the soft night air. The sommelier's body tensed as the aircraft came to a stop. They had made it, for now at least. He gathered his things, nothing too flashy, just a few essentials, a passport with a new identity, and a duffel bag with enough money to start over. The crew quickly unloaded the plane, giving him a silent nod. They had their own reasons for being here, just as he had his. But this was the last stop. Switzerland was supposed to be a fresh start, the land of neutrality, a place to disappear and rebuild. Yet, even as he walked toward the waiting car, the weight of everything he'd left behind pressed heavily on his mind. The driver was quiet, his face unreadable as they drove through the winding roads of the Swiss countryside. The small village they were heading to was isolated, an ideal place to stay hidden, far from the bustling cities where law enforcement would be hunting for him. The car moved through the darkness, the only sounds being the low hum of the engine and the occasional creak of the road beneath the tires. The sommelier sat back, looking out of the window as the landscape passed by. The serenity of the Swiss Alps, the quiet towns with their narrow streets and charming cottages, should have felt like a welcome reprieve. And yet, all he could think about was the life he had left behind, the empire he had built on lies, and the people who would never know the full extent of the operation he had run. He had been clever, calculating, always one step ahead. But now, it felt as though the walls were closing in, even in this quiet village. He had managed to escape for the moment, but the shadows of his past would always follow him. They had already started to resurface. He couldn't escape the nagging feeling that the authorities were still on his trail, that someone somewhere was piecing together the puzzle of his operation. The car finally turned down a small dirt road, and as the headlights illuminated the rustic cabin at the end of the path, the sommelier's anxiety lessened just a fraction. This would be his sanctuary, at least for a little while. He had a few contacts in the area who could help him lay low. People who knew the value of discretion, people who owed him favors from the old days. The driver stopped the car in front of the cabin and turned to face him. "This is it," he said simply. "You'll be safe here for now." "Thank you," the sommelier replied, his voice calm but filled with a sense of finality. "How long do you think I have before they start looking for me here?" The driver hesitated, eyes flickering toward the surrounding woods. "Not long. They're likely already tracing your movements. You've got a few days, maybe a week, before they figure out where you went." The sommelier nodded. A week. That was all the time he had to get himself settled, to start over. He couldn't afford to waste it. The stakes had never been higher. One slip-up, one wrong move, and the authorities would be on him again. He stepped out of the car, grateful for the cool mountain air as it filled his lungs. The crisp scent of pine and earth grounded him for a moment, but as he walked toward the cabin, the reality of his situation loomed large. This was his last chance at freedom. The sommelier had lived a life of luxury and deception, but now it was time to disappear, to leave behind everything he had ever known. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the smell of wood and herbs. The small space was sparsely furnished but cozy. Everything he needed, nothing he didn't. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows across the room. He walked over to the window and peered out at the village, the streetlights flickering faintly in the distance. It was peaceful here, too peaceful, perhaps. And that's exactly why he'd come. But peace couldn't erase the past. The smuggling ring, the lives he had ruined, the trust he had broken. Even here, hidden away in this remote corner of the world, the sommelier knew that one day the consequences would catch up with him. He sank into the chair by the fire, his fingers running across the surface of the small table in front of him. He thought about his old operation, the network of smugglers, the shipments that had flowed smoothly from country to country, the trust he had built with his contacts. It had been a well-oiled machine, perfect in its execution. But now it was gone. The casks, the wine, the stolen treasures, they were all history. And with them went his empire. For the first time in years, the sommelier allowed himself to feel a slight sense of emptiness. He had spent so long chasing success, building something he thought would last forever. But the truth was, nothing lasts forever. Not empires, not people, not even the best laid plans. He had reached the end of one road, and the road ahead was uncertain. What would he do now? Could he rebuild? Could he find redemption? Or was he forever doomed to live in the shadows of his past? These were questions he would have to answer soon enough. For now, though, he simply allowed himself to rest. The fire crackled gently in the hearth, and the shadows of the cabin seemed to grow deeper around him. The sommelier closed his eyes, listening to the stillness of the night outside. He was far from home, far from the life he had once known, but as the hours passed in silence, one thought persisted in his mind. It wasn't over. Not yet. The sommelier woke early the next morning to the sound of birds chirping and the soft rustling of leaves outside. The crisp Swiss air had seeped into the cabin overnight, and as he stretched his limbs, he felt a certain heaviness settle over him. The stillness of the countryside was both soothing and suffocating. For the first time, he felt completely alone. He made himself a simple breakfast, the quiet hum of the cabin the only sound filling the space. There was no one to answer to now, no shipments to organize, no contacts to reassure. It was the freedom he had sought, but now that he had it, it felt emptier than he had imagined. His past had been so full of movement, planning, executing, scheming, but now there was just stillness. The fire of his former empire was reduced to a few glowing embers, fading out with each passing moment. As he sat by the window, the mountain range stretched out before him, majestic and serene. The cabin was perched at the edge of a small, sleepy village, and though he had all the privacy he could want, there was something unsettling about it. Here, no one would recognize him. Here, he was just another man in hiding. The adrenaline of the life he had once led, cunning, power-driven, and ambitious, was missing. He felt the ache of that emptiness. The village, so peaceful and quiet, was a stark contrast to the chaotic world he had left behind. The gentle sounds of nature, the occasional rumble of a tractor, and the distant laughter of a child were all that broke the silence. It was a far cry from the high-stakes life of smuggling, the art of deception, and the thrill of staying ahead of the law. The sommelier realized that his former life had been an addiction, a rush that he could no longer chase in this remote place. Now, he could only exist in the present, far from the world he had built with so much cunning. But despite the peace, he couldn't shake the tension that had settled into his bones. His empire was gone, and the weight of the decisions he had made over the years pressed down on him. Smuggling, deception, and manipulation had been his tools for so long, but what now? What was left for him in this quiet, isolated place? There were no answers. Not yet. He couldn't allow himself to think too much about the future. Not now, not when he was still in the process of vanishing. The law was likely still chasing him, even if they hadn't yet caught up. Somewhere, someone would remember the empire he'd built, the operations he'd masterminded, the lives he'd manipulated. And soon enough, someone would be looking for him again. But for now, he had a little time. He'd gotten away, at least for the moment, and that was something to hold on to. He had money, enough to live off for the time being, and a new identity. All he had to do now was figure out what to do with it. The days passed slowly. He spent them walking through the village, making small talk with the locals, buying bread from the market, and keeping to himself. He was for the most part invisible. The villagers were friendly enough, but they were also a bit wary of outsiders, and the sommelier made sure not to draw attention. He was careful with every move, calculating the risk of even the smallest interaction. The last thing he wanted was to leave any trace of his past behind. But as time went on, the sommelier began to realize something else. The isolation was wearing on him. In his past life, he had always been surrounded by people, always in motion. Now, he was alone with his thoughts, and that solitude brought something with it that he hadn't fully expected: regret. He tried to push it away, but it lingered. The faces of the people he had manipulated, the lives he had ruined, the victims who had lost everything in the wake of his smuggling operation, they all came to him in flashes. The memories of how easily he had taken advantage of the trust placed in him felt like a heavy burden on his conscience. But no matter how much he tried to silence those thoughts, they wouldn't go away. The village, though peaceful, felt like a prison in those moments. The silence was deafening. He couldn't escape the truth of what he had done, even in the stillness of this small, remote place. And then, the unexpected happened. A familiar name surfaced in a quiet conversation at the village market. The sommelier overheard it as he was buying his morning bread. The man speaking didn't seem to think much of it, but the words caught the sommelier's attention immediately. It was the name of one of his former associates, someone who had been deeply involved in the smuggling network. For a brief moment, the sommelier's heart skipped a beat. He listened more intently, trying to gauge if anyone else had heard the name. The man speaking wasn't offering anything new, just a simple story about how this associate had gone missing a few months after the operation had collapsed. The sommelier's pulse quickened as he realized the truth. He wasn't as hidden as he thought. The web he had woven, the people he had manipulated, hadn't completely disappeared. They were still out there, still connected, still talking. The sommelier forced himself to walk away from the market, his mind racing. The authorities weren't the only ones who could find him. His old contacts, those who had been part of the network, could easily track him down. He was still a part of their world, even if he had severed ties with it. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that his escape wasn't just about outrunning the authorities. It was about severing every tie to his old life, people, places, and memories that could lead back to him. He had come to Switzerland to disappear, but the world was still watching. It was a realization that hit him like a cold wave, and suddenly, the peaceful Swiss cabin, the quiet village, felt much smaller. The walls that he had thought would offer him protection now felt like they were closing in around him. His past, it seemed, wasn't finished with him yet. The sommelier's mind was in turmoil. The whisper of his past had drifted into the quiet Swiss village like a ghost, reminding him that no matter how far he ran, he could never truly escape. The faces of those he had betrayed, the lives he had ruined, and the empire he had carefully built and destroyed would always be part of him. He had built his criminal empire on deception, but now the very thing that made him successful, his ability to remain undetected, was the same thing that made him vulnerable. For a few days, the sommelier did what he did best. He waited. He spent his time walking through the village, trying to blend in, listening to the villagers talk, collecting small bits of information without drawing attention to himself. He needed to be sure that the whispers he had overheard in the market were nothing more than idle gossip. But the more he listened, the more he became convinced that his past was catching up to him. It wasn't long before the sommelier realized that he had made a grave mistake. The world he had once controlled, with its network of trusted contacts and operatives, was not something that could simply vanish. His former associates, the ones who had helped him move goods and build his empire, were not the types to simply disappear into the shadows without a trace. And if one of them had been spotted in the village, there was a chance others would follow. The village, with its idyllic charm and slow pace, now felt suffocating. It was as if every corner, every shadow, held a reminder of what he had done. The long walks, once a source of peace, had become a routine in which he was constantly looking over his shoulder. He couldn't trust anyone, not even the kind, old villagers who greeted him with smiles every morning. Every interaction felt like it could be the one that led someone to recognize him. And if that happened, the authorities would be on him within hours. One evening, after a long day of feeling the weight of his own paranoia, the sommelier decided to take action. He could no longer wait for the storm to catch up to him. He needed to leave before it was too late. The small town, despite its charm, was not the refuge he had hoped for. It was a trap. The same instincts that had once kept him ahead of the law, that had built his empire, told him it was time to go. He spent the night packing what little he had left. His passport, a few bills, and the last of his cash reserves, enough to get him through the next few weeks, enough to secure a temporary escape. He knew he couldn't stay in the cabin any longer. The village was too quiet, and his instincts told him that it wouldn't take long for someone to connect the dots. The closer he stayed to the village, the more likely it was that someone, perhaps even someone he once trusted, would eventually come looking for him. He packed up his things in silence, moving methodically, just as he had done countless times before in his smuggling operation. But this time, it felt different. This time, there was no network of allies to rely on, no loyal contacts waiting to help him. This time, it was just him and the weight of his past. As he slipped out of the cabin and into the dark night, his mind raced through his options. There was only one place he could go, back to where it all began. The operation had started in the vineyards of Italy, and despite the fact that his empire had crumbled, there were still remnants of his network there. It was risky, dangerous even, but it was his only choice. He had to disappear into the shadows once again, and the first step was to get to Italy, where he could blend in with the underworld he had known so well. He started down the narrow path leading away from the cabin, keeping his steps light. The night was still, the sky clear and full of stars. His breath formed small clouds in the cool air, and as he walked, he allowed himself to be consumed by the dark thoughts that swirled in his mind. Was this the end? Was he always going to be running, forever haunted by his past? The guilt and regret threatened to overtake him, but he quickly shoved those feelings down. There was no time for reflection now. He couldn't afford to slow down, couldn't afford to stop moving. As he reached the road, he saw the headlights of a car approaching in the distance. His pulse quickened, his mind immediately flashing to the worst-case scenario. But as the car passed, it continued down the road without slowing. It was just a regular vehicle, the driver unaware of the man who had just stepped off the road. The sommelier took a deep breath, calming his racing thoughts. He had made it this far, and now he just had to keep moving. Every step, every mile brought him closer to his next destination, closer to the life he had to rebuild. The small Swiss village was fading behind him, and in its place, a new chapter of his life was beginning. The past would always linger, but the sommelier knew that the only way forward was to keep running, to keep reinventing himself until his name was nothing more than a whisper in the wind. And so he walked on. The drive to Italy was uneventful, yet each mile felt like a heavy step towards something inevitable. The sommelier had always known how to move in and out of the shadows, how to change his identity, how to slip through the cracks. But there was no escaping the truth now. He was running out of places to hide. The car hummed along the winding mountain roads as dawn broke, casting a soft light over the landscape. The sommelier had taken a series of back roads to avoid checkpoints, but there was no denying the fact that this journey back to Italy was a risk. The farther he got, the more likely it was that someone would recognize him, someone from his past. The life he had lived, the people he had manipulated, and the empire he had built weren't as easily erased as he had hoped. The small Italian towns he passed through on his way to the city where it all began felt strangely familiar. He hadn't realized how much he missed the chaos of Italy, the hustle and bustle of the streets, the noise of people moving about their business. It was a far cry from the quiet solitude of the Swiss cabin, and it felt like stepping back into a life that in some ways he had never truly left. But even as he felt a strange sense of nostalgia for the life he had once lived, the weight of his past was never far from his mind. He had made so many mistakes, so many miscalculations, and now everything he had built was crumbling around him. His smuggling ring had gone from a perfectly orchestrated operation to a fractured, disjointed mess. His contacts were either in hiding or in jail, and there was little chance he could rebuild it to its former glory. The sommelier's mind drifted back to the beginnings of the operation. It had started small, a few casks of wine, a few carefully chosen associates. But over time, the network had expanded, each new shipment opening up new avenues for profit. The wine casks, the perfect cover, had been the key to it all. He had smuggled everything from antiques to rare electronics, hiding it all beneath the layers of rich Italian wine. And for a while it had worked. It had worked perfectly. But as his empire grew, so did his arrogance. He had underestimated the authorities, assuming that his plan was flawless, that the wine would always provide the perfect cover. But over time, the authorities began to catch on. They noticed the patterns, the inconsistencies. The cracks began to form, and now he was here on the run, with nothing but a few bills, an old identity, and a few contacts who might still be loyal. The sommelier glanced at his reflection in the rearview mirror. His face, once confident and composed, now looked worn, tired. There were dark circles under his eyes, and the lines of stress were evident. This wasn't the life he had planned for himself. He had always believed that he could outrun the consequences, that he could disappear into the shadows and continue his operations as if nothing had changed. But now, the past was closing in on him, and there was no more room to hide. The car sped through the winding roads of northern Italy. the familiar landscape of vineyards and small villages unfolding before him. The smell of fresh grapes carried on the breeze, and for a brief moment, he thought about the vineyards he had once frequented. It was strange, almost surreal, to be back in a place that had played such a large role in his rise to power. Eventually, he reached the outskirts of Milan, the city that had once been the center of his operations. The towering buildings and bustling streets seemed almost foreign to him now, as if he had stepped into a different world. Milan had always been a city of opportunity, a place where business and power thrived. It had been the perfect environment for the smuggling operation to flourish, with its proximity to international trade routes and its status as a financial hub. But as he drove through the city's streets, his thoughts shifted. Milan had become a symbol of everything he had built and everything he had lost. The warehouses where he had stored his contraband, the offices where he had negotiated deals, the quiet back-alley meetings with his contacts. Everything had once been part of the intricate machine that kept his empire running. But now it was all gone. And as he passed the familiar landmarks, he couldn't help but feel a sense of loss. The sommelier made his way to a small, discreet hotel on the edge of the city. It was a place he had used before, one that offered anonymity and privacy, away from the prying eyes of the public. He checked in under a new name, one he had used in the past for low-profile transactions, and made his way to the room. Once inside, he collapsed onto the bed, the exhaustion of the journey catching up with him. He had made it to Milan, but there was no sense of victory, no triumph in his escape. Instead, there was only the crushing weight of uncertainty. The authorities were closing in, his network was fractured, and the past was something he couldn't outrun. As he lay there, staring at the ceiling, the sommelier realized the true cost of his actions. He had spent years building a criminal empire based on deception, and now that empire was crumbling. The people he had deceived, the lives he had ruined, he couldn't escape them, not even in this small hotel room, not even in the quiet streets of Milan. He had made his choices, and now there was no turning back. The days in Milan passed slowly, the weight of the sommelier's choices bearing down on him like an unrelenting storm. He moved carefully through the city, avoiding familiar places and old contacts. He didn't dare make any phone calls or send any messages, knowing that one slip-up could lead the authorities straight to him. His movements were methodical, each step taken with the kind of caution that had once been second nature to him, but now felt like an exhausting burden. He spent most of his time in the small hotel room, pacing the worn wooden floors, occasionally glancing at the window where the bustling city life carried on without him. Milan, a city that had once been a center of his empire, now felt like a cage. Outside, the world went on, unaware of the man who had once been at its center. The thought that life was moving without him, without his involvement, left him feeling strangely irrelevant. The only people who knew he was here were those from his past, and they couldn't be trusted. The few associates who had escaped the fallout of the operation had scattered to the winds. Some had been arrested, others had gone underground, and the rest were likely in hiding, just like him. The sommelier had severed all ties with the world he had once controlled, but even now, he couldn't escape the constant reminder of what he had lost. The money he had made, the power he had enjoyed, and most painfully, the network of trust that had held his empire together. Now it was all gone. The sommelier had been part of something much bigger than himself, something that had made him feel invincible. But now, he was just another fugitive, a man on the run from the life he had created. He found himself dwelling on the past more than he would have liked, the faces of those who had once been loyal to him haunting his thoughts. What would they think of him now? Would they see him as a failure? Or would they, too, be scrambling to escape their own fates? One evening, unable to sit still any longer, he ventured out into the city, blending into the shadows as he walked through the familiar streets. He tried to stay inconspicuous, his face hidden beneath the brim of his cap. The crowded streets of Milan, filled with tourists and locals, provided him with a sense of anonymity. But even as he moved through the city, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, was watching him. His instincts, the same instincts that had kept him ahead of the authorities all these years, were on high alert. It wasn't paranoia, it was experience. He had always known that the game of smuggling, of deception, wasn't just about avoiding detection. It was about maintaining control, staying one step ahead of the law. But now, it felt as though the law had caught up with him. No matter where he went, he was still trapped in the web he had woven. As he passed through a quiet alley, he caught sight of something that made his heart skip a beat. A figure he recognized, standing just outside a small cafe. It was one of his old associates, a man who had once worked closely with him during the height of his operation. The sommelier's breath caught in his throat. What was he doing here? Was he looking for him? He ducked into the shadows, keeping a careful eye on the man, who seemed unaware of his presence. The sommelier's mind raced. Could this be someone from the authorities? Or was it simply a coincidence, a chance encounter with a man from his past? Either way, the risk was too great. He couldn't afford to take any chances. The man looked around briefly before entering the cafe, disappearing from sight. The sommelier stood frozen for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to make a decision. Should he follow? Should he confront the man, see if he could get any information, or simply let him go? The sound of his own heartbeat filled his ears as he made his decision. He couldn't risk it. He couldn't risk drawing attention to himself, not when everything was so fragile. With a quiet, controlled breath, he turned and walked away, making his way back toward the hotel. His pulse was still racing, and his mind was consumed with 1,000 thoughts. Was this a sign? A coincidence? Or had someone finally found him? Back in the hotel room, he locked the door behind him and leaned against the wall, trying to calm his thoughts. His gut told him that the authorities were closing in, but he still couldn't shake the feeling that someone from his past might be a bigger threat. The people he had once worked with had their own agendas now. Some would see him as a liability, a man who had fallen from grace. Others might be looking for answers, hoping to connect the dots of the operation that had crumbled. The sommelier knew that his next move had to be calculated, and he couldn't afford to be reckless. His options were running out, and staying in Milan for much longer wasn't an option. He needed to disappear again, but where could he go? The world was too small now, too interconnected. Every flight, every train ride, every transaction could be tracked. He had once been the master of his fate, pulling strings and orchestrating deals from the shadows. But now, it felt as though the strings were being pulled on him. The empire he had built was gone, and he was nothing more than a fugitive, a man trying to outrun his own mistakes. He had a few contacts left, people who might be able to help him disappear, people who owed him favors. But time was running out. The walls were closing in, and the sommelier, the man who had once seemed untouchable, was now just another man on the run, with nothing left but the past chasing after him. The sommelier spent the next few days trying to shake off the unease that had settled over him like a heavy fog. Every time he ventured out, every time he left the safety of his hotel room, he felt like he was being watched. The city of Milan, once a place where he felt powerful and untouchable, now felt like a labyrinth of risks and dangers. His every movement seemed to carry the weight of his past. each step reminding him that his time in the shadows was growing short. He had made the decision to leave Milan, but where would he go next? He couldn't stay here any longer, not with the way things were escalating. His mind raced with possibilities, but each option seemed to lead to another dead end. He needed to get off the radar completely. Switzerland had given him a moment of respite, but the quiet village and the isolation had only served to make him realize how exposed he truly was. There was nowhere that felt completely safe now. A few days passed in uneasy silence. The sommelier kept to himself, staying in the room, working out his plans in his mind, as the city outside continued its daily routine. He had learned not to trust anyone, and certainly not the people he once called allies. The web he had woven for so many years had been an illusion of control, and now, all that was left was a series of loose ends, waiting to unravel. And then one afternoon, the phone rang. The sound sliced through the quiet of the room like a knife, pulling him from his thoughts. For a moment, he hesitated, his pulse quickening. He had no one to call, no one he could trust. But the phone kept ringing, each ring a reminder that he couldn't hide forever. Slowly, he picked it up. "Hello," he said, his voice steady, betraying no emotion. "Are you alone?" The voice on the other end was low, familiar, but laced with a tone of urgency. The sommelier's heart skipped a beat. He recognized the voice immediately. It was Marco, one of his oldest associates, someone who had worked with him for years. But why was he calling now? "Yes," the sommelier replied, glancing over his shoulder as if the walls were closing in. "What's going on?" "There's no time to explain everything," Marco said, his voice low. "But you need to get out of Milan. The authorities are already here. There's been a leak, and they know you're in the city." The sommelier's breath caught in his throat. "How do you know this?" Marco hesitated. "I've been keeping an eye on things. The people you trust, the ones who are supposed to be covering your tracks, they've betrayed you." The weight of those words hit him like a brick. Betrayal. It wasn't something he had thought would come from the people closest to him. But now it was clear. The empire he had built, the network of loyal men and women who had once helped him hide in plain sight, was collapsing. And the cracks were too wide to fix. "Who?" The sommelier's voice was sharp now, his thoughts racing. "Who is it?" Marco sighed on the other end of the line. "I don't know the full details, but I've heard rumors. There are whispers about the money trails, about the shipments you've made. People are talking. And the authorities, they're closer than ever." A bitter laugh escaped the sommelier's lips. "I should have known. I should have seen it coming." "There's still time to escape," Marco said, his voice urgent. "But you need to leave now before it's too late. I've arranged a safe house. It's out of the city. You'll be safe there for a while." The sommelier didn't hesitate. He knew what he had to do. The plan Marco was offering him was his last chance at freedom. He had to take it, or he would be caught, just like the rest of his associates. "Where?" he asked quickly, already gathering his things. "Meet me in the old warehouse near the docks. It's abandoned. No one will be watching." The sommelier didn't need more information. He disconnected the call and quickly gathered his things, documents, a little cash, and his old passport, still valid under the false name. He moved swiftly, but he was no longer operating out of instinct. Now every move felt deliberate, cautious. The risk was too high. As he stepped out of the hotel room, his pulse quickened. Every corner, every shadow, felt like it was hiding someone waiting to grab him. But he had no choice but to keep moving. The walls were closing in, and the door to freedom was growing smaller by the second. He made his way through the crowded streets of Milan, blending in as best as he could. The city was alive with activity. Tourists walking along the cobblestone streets, locals going about their daily routines. But the sommelier couldn't help but feel like an intruder in this world, a man who didn't belong. He could feel the tension building inside him, the pressure of what was at stake. Every moment felt like a step closer to his past catching up with him. The docks were quieter than the rest of the city. The hum of engines and the sound of footsteps on wet concrete echoed in the distance. He approached the old warehouse, his breath steady but his thoughts racing. The air smelled of salt and oil, and as he reached the entrance, he saw Marco waiting near the back door, his figure barely visible in the low light. Marco's expression was grim. "You need to leave the city immediately. There's no time to waste." The sommelier nodded. He didn't need any more words. He had no intention of staying any longer than necessary. The only thing that mattered now was disappearing and never looking back. "Let's go," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. They moved quickly, the shadows of the warehouse swallowing them whole as they made their way toward the back exit, the sound of footsteps echoing through the empty space. As they stepped outside, the sommelier could hear the distant sound of sirens. The chase had begun. The sommelier's heart pounded in his chest as he followed Marco down the dark alleyway, the sound of his footsteps echoing off the narrow walls. His mind raced, calculating each move, each turn, as they navigated the quiet backstreets of Milan. The sirens in the distance sent a chill down his spine, a constant reminder that time was running out. He had escaped for now, but he couldn't afford to slow down. Marco, ever the professional, led him to a small, inconspicuous car parked at the end of the alley. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get them out of the city. The engine hummed quietly as Marco unlocked the doors, and the sommelier slid into the passenger seat without a word. "You've got a place to hide out, right?" Marco asked, his eyes scanning the street behind them before slipping into the driver's seat. The sommelier nodded. "I've got a contact. We'll head there." They pulled out of the alley, merging into the flow of traffic. Milan was bustling as always, the city moving at its usual pace. But the sommelier could feel the danger lurking just beneath the surface. He had spent his life moving through cities like this, using the crowds as his cover, but now the anonymity he once relied on felt like a trap. Everywhere he looked, he saw potential threats, strangers, cameras, even the quiet hum of surveillance drones overhead. Marco drove carefully, taking side streets and avoiding major intersections, doing everything he could to stay off the radar. The city grew more and more distant as they drove, leaving behind the crowded streets and the looming threat of discovery. The sommelier didn't speak, his mind still reeling from everything that had happened. The network he had spent years building was fractured beyond repair. The connections he had trusted were now just liabilities. The life he had known, the empire he had once ruled with subtlety and grace, had crumbled to dust in a matter of weeks. And now, here he was on the run, with only Marco and a few fleeting contacts standing between him and his inevitable capture. They drove for hours, the city gradually fading into the countryside, until they reached a small, secluded villa on the outskirts of northern Italy. The villa was surrounded by thick woods, offering the kind of seclusion the sommelier needed to lay low for a while. Marco pulled up to the gate and stopped. He glanced at the sommelier. "I'll leave you here. It's not much, but it'll be enough for a while." The sommelier nodded, his gaze fixed on the villa. "Thanks, Marco. You've done more than enough." "I'm not doing this for you," Marco replied with a faint smile. "I'm doing this for me. You've got your way out. I've got mine." The sommelier opened the door and stepped out of the car, the cool evening air hitting his face. Marco didn't waste any more time, driving off as quickly as he had arrived. The sommelier watched him go, the sound of the car fading into the distance. As he approached the villa, the door creaked open slowly, revealing a dimly lit interior. The contact inside, an old associate from his past who had managed to avoid the authorities, stood waiting at the door. "You made it," the man said, his voice gruff but welcoming. He stepped aside to let the sommelier in. The sommelier stepped inside, the warmth of the fire greeting him as he entered. The contact, a man named Stefano, had been in the business for just as long as the sommelier, though he had always been more cautious, less ambitious. That caution had served him well, allowing him to avoid the fallout that had destroyed the sommelier's empire. "This is it?" the sommelier asked, glancing around the modest villa. Stefano gave a small nod. "It's enough. For now, at least. You'll stay here until the heat dies down." The sommelier sat down by the fire, his body tense. There was no real peace in this moment, just the unsettling realization that he was back to square one. But he had survived this long. Maybe survival was all he could hope for now. "You've got a lot of people looking for you," Stefano said after a long pause. "The authorities, sure, but also some old friends. They're not happy with how things ended." The sommelier's jaw tightened. "I'm not interested in old friends." "Still," Stefano continued, his voice low, "you've made a lot of enemies. You're a marked man now, and the clock is ticking." The sommelier exhaled slowly. "I know, but it's the only option I've got." Stefano didn't argue. Instead, he stepped toward the small kitchen and returned with a bottle of wine. He opened it and poured 2 glasses, offering one to the sommelier. "You're a man of taste. Maybe you can find some comfort in that." The sommelier took the glass, staring into the ruby-red liquid. "Maybe, but wine can't fix what's been broken." He didn't want to dwell on the past, but the memories kept coming back. The smuggling operation, the wine casks, the people who had trusted him, and the empire that had crumbled. It all seemed so far away now, a distant dream that he could never return to. "I'm done with it all," the sommelier said quietly, almost to himself. "Done with the game, done with the lies. I've had enough." Stefano watched him for a moment before replying. "We all have our limits. Just remember, there's no going back. Once you leave this life, it's gone for good." The sommelier nodded slowly. He took a sip of the wine, letting the taste linger on his tongue. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to relax, if only for a moment. The world outside was still waiting for him, but for now, in this small villa tucked away in the hills, he could escape the noise. It wouldn't last forever. Nothing did. But for now, the sommelier had found a small slice of peace. And that, for a man who had spent his life running, was all he could ask for. The days blurred together in the small villa, each one a repeat of the last, quiet, measured, and solitary. The sommelier had learned to embrace the silence, but it gnawed at him, a constant reminder of how far he had fallen from the life he once controlled. He spent his mornings in a haze of thoughts, his evenings nursing a glass of wine, and his nights staring at the flickering fire as if it could somehow guide him back to a place of certainty. Stefano kept to himself, occasionally checking in to make sure the sommelier was comfortable, though neither man spoke much about the past. The world outside the villa had its own rhythm, and the sommelier couldn't help but wonder how it was going on without him. The networks he had so carefully built were in disarray, and his old contacts had either vanished or fallen under the weight of the operation's collapse. There were whispers of betrayals, arrests, and broken deals, but none of it mattered now. He had severed all ties, and for the first time, he felt like a ghost, unseen, unheard, and irrelevant. The villa, surrounded by thick woods, was an ideal hiding place, but it was also a reminder of his isolation. The distant sound of footsteps on the gravel path, the rustling of the leaves, the occasional sight of a bird in the trees. Everything felt far removed from the world he had once known. Here, there were no high-stakes deals, no international shipments, no calculated risks. There was only the quiet that seemed to press in on him from all sides. But even in this quiet, a part of him couldn't escape the feeling that something was amiss. He had been careful, cautious in his movements, and yet he couldn't shake the nagging suspicion that someone knew where he was. It had been a few weeks since he'd last heard anything about the authorities closing in on him, but the silence only made him more paranoid. The calm before the storm, he thought. It was never this easy. One afternoon, as he sat by the window, staring out at the winding road that led to the villa, a car appeared in the distance, kicking up dust as it approached. His heart skipped a beat. It was too early for anyone to be visiting, and his first instinct was to retreat into the shadows, to hide from whatever was coming. But something stopped him. He stood up slowly, his pulse quickening, and watched the car draw nearer. The vehicle came to a stop just outside the villa, and a figure stepped out. The sommelier's heart pounded in his chest as the person approached the door. There was something familiar about the way they moved, but he couldn't place it. Stefano appeared from the other room, his expression unreadable. "Stay here," he said, his voice firm. "It's best if you don't show yourself." The sommelier nodded, but didn't take his eyes off the approaching visitor. Something was off. He couldn't explain it, but the feeling in his gut told him that this was no ordinary visit. Stefano opened the door, and the visitor stepped inside. From where the sommelier stood, he couldn't see their face, but there was an air of familiarity. He strained to hear their conversation, but could only catch snippets. "Is he here?" The voice was low but unmistakably urgent. "Yes," Stefano replied, "but I don't know how much longer we can keep this up." The sommelier's heart raced. He knew those words were meant for him. How much longer we can keep this up? It was the tone of someone who had seen the cracks forming in the walls, someone who was about to be exposed. The visitor was someone from his past, someone who had come looking for him. But for what? A chill ran down the sommelier's spine as he took a step closer to the door. He had to know who it was. He had to know what they wanted. He moved quietly through the villa, staying in the shadows, careful not to make a sound. The conversation continued in low murmurs, but he could hear enough to know it wasn't good. "I'm not sure how much longer we can hide you," the visitor said, voice thick with concern. "There's too much attention now. They're starting to piece things together." The sommelier felt his breath catch in his throat. The authorities? Had they found him already? "Listen." Stefano's voice was sharper now, his patience wearing thin. "You're putting us all at risk. We can't keep him hidden forever. The game is up." The sommelier didn't wait to hear any more. He knew that if he stayed, if he didn't act now, the game would indeed be up. He had lived his life in the shadows for too long, but now those shadows were closing in on him. He was no longer the one pulling the strings. He was the one being hunted. Without thinking, he grabbed his jacket, slipped through the back door, and into the woods. He moved swiftly, instinctively, not looking back. His mind raced as he forged a path through the trees, heading toward the one place he thought he could go, the old port. There was a chance he could get out, disappear into the crowd, and make his way across the sea to a new life. But that life felt more and more like an illusion as the footsteps behind him grew louder. He was being followed. His pulse quickened as he pushed forward, trying to stay ahead of whoever was tracking him. The air was thick with tension, and his thoughts were a blur of calculations and fears. He couldn't afford to be caught. Not now. Not after everything he had been through. The forest stretched ahead of him, dark and silent, but the sound of footsteps grew closer. He had to act fast. The sommelier knew that his time was running out, that whatever game he had been playing, whatever empire he had built, was crumbling faster than he could escape. With a final push, he broke through the trees and reached the road leading to the port. He had one chance left, but in his mind he knew, no matter how fast he ran, there was no outrunning the past forever. The sommelier's breath was ragged as he raced down the road, the distant sound of footsteps behind him urging him to move faster. The cool night air whipped against his face as he sprinted, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts, plans, escape routes, and above all, the overwhelming knowledge that this was his last chance. There would be no more hiding after this. If he didn't make it to the port, if he didn't escape now, everything would collapse. His eyes scanned the path ahead, the familiar sight of the docks drawing closer with every step. The faint glow of the streetlights illuminated the road, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward him, as though the past itself was reaching out to pull him back. He refused to look behind him, but the sound of those footsteps continued, growing louder, closer, more menacing. The port was still a few hundred yards away, and even though he knew the distance was closing, his legs felt heavier with each step. It had been years since he'd run like this, not from danger, but from the life he had once built. He could hear his own heartbeat, pounding in his chest like a warning, but there was no turning back. As he neared the docks, he spotted a familiar silhouette, a figure standing just out of reach, at the edge of the water. A boat, small and unmarked, bobbed quietly in the harbor. The man on the dock was waiting for him, his posture casual but his eyes sharp, scanning the shadows for any signs of trouble. The sommelier reached the edge of the port, but before he could make his way toward the boat, the sound of someone calling his name stopped him dead in his tracks. "Stop!" The voice was unmistakable. Marco. He had followed him. The sommelier's heart sank. Marco had been the last person he expected to chase him down. He was supposed to be an ally, someone who had helped him get away from the authorities, someone who owed him. But here he was, calling out to him in the dark, standing between the sommelier and his only means of escape. The sommelier hesitated, his hand resting on the rope that led to the boat. He wanted to keep running, to leave everything behind, but he couldn't ignore Marco, not now. Not after everything they had been through. He turned slowly to face his old associate, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. "What is it, Marco?" Marco took a step forward, his face half lit by the dim glow of the port's lights. His eyes were wide, his brow furrowed in concern. "You don't have to do this," Marco said, his voice soft but firm. "It's not too late to turn around. They'll find you, you know. There's nowhere left to hide." The sommelier's hand tightened around the rope. "I've already been found, Marco. I've been running for too long. And now it's time to disappear." Marco took another step closer, his gaze intense. "You don't get it, do you? You can't just walk away from everything you've done. You've already made too many enemies, too many mistakes. You don't get to simply vanish. They'll find you, and they won't stop until they do." The sommelier's jaw tightened. "I've already lost everything. The operation, the empire, the people I trusted. It's all gone. And now I'm done with it. Done with all of it." Marco's eyes flickered, and for a moment, the sommelier thought he might just let him go. But then Marco spoke again, his voice carrying an edge of frustration. "This isn't just about what you've lost. It's about what's coming for you. They've got everything they need now. Your network's gone, the authorities know your every move, and you think you can just slip away into the shadows like nothing ever happened? There's no hiding anymore." The sommelier stared at him, the weight of Marco's words sinking in. He knew Marco was right. His world had crumbled. But that didn't matter now. He couldn't just let them win. He couldn't let the past define him forever. "I don't have a choice, Marco," the sommelier said, his voice low but steady. "There's nothing left for me here. This is the only way out." Marco looked at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a deep sigh, he shook his head. "You're wrong, you know. There's always a choice. But I guess you've made yours." The sommelier didn't reply. He didn't need to. Marco had made his choice too. The silence that followed was thick with the weight of unspoken understanding. The two men stood there for a moment longer, each caught in the quiet storm of their own decisions. Then, without another word, Marco stepped aside. The sommelier didn't hesitate. He turned back to the boat, untied the rope, and shoved it into the water. The small vessel floated easily, and as he climbed in, he could feel the weight of the world start to lift. He wasn't free yet, not by a long shot. But for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt like he had a chance. Marco watched him go, his figure growing smaller and smaller as the sommelier pushed the boat out into the open water. The dock, the port, and the city of Milan receded into the distance, fading into the night. As the boat moved further from shore, the sommelier finally allowed himself to breathe. The dark water surrounded him, the quiet of the night offering a sense of calm he hadn't felt in years. The boat was small, but it was enough. It was his escape, his chance to start over, to disappear into the vastness of the world. But deep down, the sommelier knew this would only be temporary. He could never truly outrun the past. And no matter how far he sailed, the weight of his choices would always be there, lurking in the shadows. For now, though, he was free. For now, the horizon stretched before him, an endless possibility of what could come next. The future was unknown, but the sommelier had learned one thing above all else. Survival meant moving forward, even when the path was unclear. The boat rocked gently on the waves, the only sound the soft lapping of water against the hull. The sommelier steered it toward the open sea, leaving behind the safety of the Italian coastline, the city of Milan, and everything he had once known. The world felt different now, distant, as if the shoreline was a final farewell to the life that had brought him both power and destruction. The night air was crisp, the stars scattered across the sky in their eternal pattern, offering a strange sense of solace. There was a quiet here, a solitude that made the sommelier think of his past, of the empire he had built, of the wine casks, of the smiles of those who had trusted him. Now they were all memories, fading as quickly as the lights of Milan disappeared over the horizon. He thought about Marco and the final conversation they'd had. It had been bitter, yet there had been something almost inevitable in their exchange. Marco had spoken the truth, as painful as it was. There was no escaping the consequences of the sommelier's actions, no matter how far he ran. But that didn't mean he couldn't try. The world was vast, and he had spent so much time hiding in plain sight that he believed it was still possible to disappear. But the feeling of being hunted never fully left him. As much as he wanted to believe that the shadows could hide him, that the vast oceans would shield him from the past, deep down he knew better. One wrong move, one slip-up, and everything he had worked for would come crashing down again. The boat cruised through the calm waters, the soft creak of the wooden planks beneath him the only reminder that he was still grounded in some way. The somber stillness of the night stretched on, and the sommelier felt his mind begin to drift, back to memories that had been buried deep in his mind. He remembered the early days, when everything had been so simple. The vineyards, the fresh grapes, the scent of fermenting wine in the cellar. It had all seemed like a game back then, something to be played and perfected. But nothing lasts forever. The world had changed, and so had he. The empire he had built was no longer a structure of trust. It had become a house of cards, fragile and easily toppled. His mind lingered on the faces of those who had once been part of his network, people he had used and discarded, people who had fallen with him, or worse, been left behind. He had built everything on manipulation and lies, and now it was clear that nothing built on such a foundation could stand for long. The boat drifted further into the night, and the sommelier found himself reflecting on his choices. There were no guarantees now, no clear path ahead. His options were as wide and uncertain as the ocean stretching before him. He could feel the familiar pull of survival instincts, but they were tempered by the reality of his situation. He wasn't running towards something, he was running from everything. His thoughts were interrupted by the faint glow of lights in the distance. He squinted, trying to make out the shape of what lay ahead. It was another small coastal town, its silhouette barely visible against the backdrop of the sea. The sommelier's gut twisted. Should he stop? Should he risk drawing attention by seeking shelter? Or should he continue into the vast emptiness? He knew he couldn't stay out on the water indefinitely. He needed supplies, food, and a place to lay low for a while. But even as he thought about stopping, the familiar tension crept back into his chest. Could he trust anyone? Even now, after everything that had happened, could he risk making contact with someone who might recognize him, someone who might betray him? The boat continued its slow journey toward the town, the glow of the lights now brighter. The sommelier weighed his options. There was a place in town, a small, quiet inn where he had once stayed during a brief business trip. It was a risk, but it was the best option he had. He could blend in, take some time to plan his next move. And then, when the time was right, he would disappear again. For now, though, he needed to stop running. As he steered the boat toward the small dock, his mind churned with possibilities. He had no idea how long he would stay in this small town, or whether he could make it out unnoticed. He had done this many times before, but never like this. The stakes were higher now. There was no going back. When the boat finally reached the dock, the sommelier tied it up with practiced hands. His eyes scanned the area around him, checking for any signs of danger. The town seemed quiet, almost too quiet, but it was the perfect place to lay low for a while. He stepped off the boat and onto the dock, the sound of his boots clicking against the wood the only noise. The night was still, the air cool, and for the first time in a long while, the sommelier allowed himself to exhale. He made his way up the narrow path toward the inn, his steps measured and deliberate. The shadows of the town stretched across the streets, and the faint scent of salt water lingered in the air. The inn was just up ahead, a small building with a weathered sign hanging above the door. It looked unchanged, just as he remembered. There were no signs of life around it, no one on the streets. The innkeeper was probably inside, asleep. As he pushed open the door, the faint sound of a bell chimed, announcing his arrival. The inside was dim, the flickering light of a single candle casting shadows on the walls. The innkeeper, an older man with a kindly face, looked up from his desk and gave a small nod of recognition. He didn't ask questions, didn't seem surprised by the sommelier's arrival. This place was one of many stops on his old circuit, quiet, out of the way, and unnoticed. "I'll take the usual room," the sommelier said quietly, his voice steady. The innkeeper nodded and handed him a key. "Room 7, he said, without missing a beat. The sommelier took the key and made his way up the narrow staircase. Room 7 was at the end of the hall, tucked away from the other rooms. It was small, simple, and perfect for his needs. As he entered, he locked the door behind him and set his things down. He stood by the window for a moment, looking out over the darkened town. The quiet was deafening, but it was the kind of silence he had longed for. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to imagine that this could be the end of his running. Maybe, just maybe, he could start over. But as he sat down on the bed, the harsh reality set in. No matter how far he went, the past would always be there, lurking in the shadows. The sommelier closed his eyes, trying to quiet the noise in his mind, knowing that the future was uncertain and that the past would always have a way of catching up. The sommelier sat in the small room, the silence wrapping around him like a heavy blanket. The inn was quiet, almost too quiet, but it was a place of refuge for now. The low hum of the sea from the distance was the only thing breaking the stillness outside. He leaned back against the worn bed, staring up at the ceiling. His mind wandered, his past, his mistakes, his losses, and it was hard to shake the feeling that this, too, was only temporary. Even as he had taken refuge in the inn, he knew this life would catch up with him. It was inevitable. No matter how far he ran, no matter how many towns he hid in, his past would always find a way to catch up with him. The authorities were closing in, but there was something more haunting: the betrayal, the cracks within his own network. The people who had once been loyal to him were now scattered, and those who remained were likely just as desperate as he was to stay out of sight. For a moment, he let his thoughts linger on the life he had once built, the empire of smuggling, of high-end antiques and rare electronics hidden beneath layers of wine and legitimate shipments. It had been a world of trust, but that trust had been shattered. People he thought he could count on had either turned on him or disappeared into the shadows. And now he was alone, with nothing but his regrets and the pieces of his shattered life. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. He stood up slowly, his muscles stiff from sitting too long. His hand instinctively reached for the small knife he had stashed beneath the bed. Old habits, hard to break. But then he remembered where he was. The door opened with a soft creak. It was the innkeeper, holding a tray of food. "I thought you might be hungry," the old man said kindly, his eyes studying the sommelier's face. "It's not much, but it's hot." The sommelier nodded, trying to shake off the heaviness of his thoughts. "Thank you," he said, taking the tray. The innkeeper smiled, offering a nod before leaving the room, closing the door quietly behind him. The food was simple: a crusty loaf of bread, some cheese, and a bowl of soup. He ate slowly, savoring each bite, though his mind never truly left the storm of thoughts swirling in his head. The food helped, grounding him, but the ache of uncertainty never left. Once he finished, he leaned back in the chair, staring out the window again, the lights of the town flickering faintly in the distance. The wind had picked up, rustling the trees and the leaves. It was a reminder of the world outside, one that kept moving, despite the stillness in his heart. He couldn't stay here forever. The world he had built was already gone, and the longer he lingered, the more likely someone would find him. He couldn't afford to grow comfortable. He had to move again, to disappear before he was found. He had done it before, and he could do it again. The sommelier stood up, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. His thoughts were already shifting to the next step. He couldn't afford to stay in one place for long. There were still places he could go, still people who owed him favors, but the network he had once relied on had already unraveled. It would take time, but he knew he would need to rebuild. The question was whether it would be enough. For now, though, he needed to rest. He needed to gather strength before his next move. The quiet of the room was almost too much, too still. But he closed his eyes, letting the exhaustion of the journey wash over him. Tomorrow would be another day of decisions, of risks. But tonight he would rest. Tonight he would just be a man in hiding. As he lay down on the bed, his mind quieted, the weight of the past slowly retreating, if only for a moment. The world outside, the dangers that lurked, the enemies that chased him, none of it mattered for now. For now, the sommelier was safe. But how long would that last? The answer, as always, was uncertain.